Tonight, we are honored to hear from two leading representatives of both the Democratic and the Republican parties, and we had such a great introduction from Nora O'Donnell over lunch to some of the issues from this very fascinating campaign. Our conversation tonight will be led by the highly regarded John Harwood, Chief Washington Correspondent of CNBC and a political writer for the New York Times. John has been around journalism and politics all of his life. His first trip on a presidential campaign press plane came when he was 11 years old and accompanied his father, then a political reporter for the Washington Post. His journalism career began as a copy boy at the Washington Star, and in 1991, he joined the Wall Street Journal as White House correspondent. He subsequently became the journal's political editor and chief political correspondent, and today writes the journal's political column, Washington Wire. In March 2006, he joined CNBC as chief Washington correspondent. In his spare time, John has managed to write a new book entitled Pennsylvania Avenue: Profiles in Backroom Power, so we can add that to our reading list along with Jeff Sachs' books. We're very pleased to have John with us tonight to lead what promises to be a lively political discussion.
Let's get on with the discussion. We've got two very distinguished panelists to talk to us tonight. Gayle Smith, representing the Obama campaign, and Andrew Natsios, representing the McCain campaign. Few people in Washington have a deeper understanding of foreign policy matters and of development issues in general than Gayle Smith. She's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and director of the International Rights and Responsibilities Program. During the Clinton administration, she served as senior director for African Affairs at the National Security Council, held senior positions at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Gayle was based in Africa for more than 20 years as a journalist, won the World Journalism Award from the World Affairs Council in 1991, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations of numerous boards. She was the working group chair on global poverty for the Clinton Global Initiative from 2005 to 2007. Gayle, please join us up here at the podium. Throughout a distinguished career in public service, Andrew Natsios has served in a number of positions, many of which had a direct impact on CARE's work around the world. During President Bush's first term, he was appointed the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, the lead government agency providing economic and humanitarian assistance to developing countries. He subsequently served as special coordinator for international disaster assistance, special humanitarian coordinator for the Sudan, focusing exclusively on the situation in Darfur. He's currently a professor in diplomacy at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Earlier this year, he joined with other prominent Republicans from his native Massachusetts in endorsing John McCain's bid for president. Andrew, please join us on the stage. Gayle, let me start with you. I mentioned that by simply the fact of who he is, that Barack Obama would change the United States, I believe, relationship with the rest of the world the day he was sworn in as president. But tell me, beyond that, what else could he do, should he do, to change the way America relates to the rest of the world?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is to re-engage and to look at using our power to leverage action and engagement from others.
Power differently defined than has been defined
well, I think the whole
years.
range of power. I mean, I think one of the words that one can easily and regularly associate with Barack Obama's policies is comprehensive. He is prepared to use force if necessary, but he also believes passionately that diplomacy is a very, very powerful tool, has been throughout our history and can be again, that development is a very powerful tool, so that we should use all of those. I think the other thing that he can and will do is act on a range of global issues that the next administration is going to face. If you look at the global food crisis, if you look at the world energy crisis, if you look at climate change, we will be facing increasing water scarcity, a host of other issues that demand our collective involvement. and demand that rather than just criticize the UN, for example, we engage, put ourselves in a position to lead, and reform it to make it the institution we need.
Andrew, let me just start out with you by asking if there's anything that she said that you would disagree with.
No.
So, okay, good. Well, we've got some consensus here.
But I would add some things. But I would add
for it.
some.
Would I?
Yeah, no, I know you would, Gail.
Okay, you go ahead.
I know you would, Gail. I would add that John McCain is looking at the structure of how our foreign policy apparatus is currently arrayed. And when he sees something that's not working, he will make public statements about changing it. He thinks it was a terrible mistake to put USIA into the State Department, and has publicly said he will now advocate an independent agency be recreated as it existed before, because it's not working in the State Department, and I think there's wide understanding that that was a mistake. And so there's some structural things that need to be done. The second thing that I focused on when I was here, in fact, this is the room that I used to meet the AID staff in when I ran AID for 5 years, the best 5 years of my life, I might add. I was in the NGO committee for 5 years at World Vision as a vice president, and I was in AID in the first President Bush's administration 18 years ago. That's where I started, actually 19 years ago. But this is the room I met the staff when I wanted to give them a talk about something or they wanted to ask me questions. So this is a homecoming for me. But there are three things that John McCain is focused on in terms of priorities in the world that I think sort of complement the kinds of things that I agree with Gail on. One is he wants to make sure that Iraq and Afghanistan are successes. And I had a Arab-American lawyer who had just joined the Foreign Service. She came from an immigrant family and a brilliant young woman. And she said, I opposed the war, Andrew, but she volunteered to go to Iraq very early on. I said, why are you here? She said, we went in, I didn't agree with it, but I want to make sure this works. And she did a spectacular, she spoke Arabic as a first language. And to have an Arab-American lawyer, 38-year-old lawyer who had just joined the Foreign Service in AID as a career officer, out there in the field made a big difference because a lot of Iraqi Americans said we didn't even know there were people in AID, with that kind of background. So making Iraq and Afghanistan where we have troops and we have huge investment. AID spent $6.7 billion in Iraq. AID, just AID. And right now in Afghanistan, we're spending $1.2 billion a year in reconstruction, just AID. These are the two largest programs AID's been run in 30 or 40 years in a single country. The second thing is what are called the transnational issues. The energy crisis, the rising food prices, global climate change are all issues John McCain believes we need to engage on with the rest of the world in a cooperative way. We need to do it carefully because there are a lot of very sensitive issues. Like on climate change, how do we deal with a massive growth in the Indian and Chinese economies? I mean, India and China are 35 or 40% of the world's population, just two countries. And they're growing at 9 or 12% a year. But to treat them as though we're treating Western Europe or Canada is a little unfair. They say, you're rich, so you can afford to use all this energy. We are just growing, so dealing with that is going to be a very sensitive diplomatic issue. The third set of issues are something I focused on here a lot, and that is fragile and failed states. And there's a wonderful new book, which I have to say, Helene, I know your staff's reading it, everybody's reading the NGO. I'm making all my students read it at Georgetown. And I wrote to Paul Collier and said, this is the best book that's been written on this subject. My son works for an aid agency, and he said the senior leadership bought boxes of the book. It's called The Bottom Billion by Paul Collier, who's a British academic but was at the World Bank for 20 years. John McCain believes that the most serious threat we face is not from powerful states. This is a bipartisan issue, this is not a partisan issue, but are from fragile and failed states. There are 50 very fragile states in the world. There are another 20 that are failed. They are also, in my view, the principal development challenge of our time. And he believes the only way we can deal with fragile and failed states is through an integrated policy of diplomacy and international development, and of course in the security area, because all of these countries have very serious security challenges. So that final area is personally very important to me because if we don't sharpen our instruments and our as tools of influence and programming in the US government, we're not going to be able to work with other countries to successfully deal with the state fragility. It's also the case the poorest people in the world live in these fragile states. So it's not just a national security issue, it's a development issue, and it's an ethical issue.